Hello YouTube, this is the Blackroast240 and I am doing a sort of overview on pendulum summoning. I don't really feel that anyone on YouTube has really done like a complete overview on pendulum summoning yet, so I'm just going to go through everything there is to do about it and sort of give my opinion on it at the end. So first up is how to pendulum summon. So yes, this is a wall of text. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm sure most of us know how to do it by now. So, there are two pendulum zones on either side of your field, a red one on the right and a blue one on the left. Pendulum monsters can be played from your hand as spell cards to the pendulum zones. Whilst in the pendulum zones, they are treated as spell cards and apply their pendulum effects, and while in monster card zones, they are monsters and apply their monster effects. Pendulum monsters cannot be set to a pendulum zone, so you can't play them face down and flip them up later. Pendulum monsters cannot be removed from play, cannot be removed to play a new one like a field spell can be. So you can't just play a new one over it. Pendulum monsters are spell cards, but do not count as any type of spell. What I mean by that is that while they're in the pendulum zones and counting as spell cards, they don't have a type, so they aren't normal spells, they aren't quick plays, they aren't continuous, they are just spell cards with no type, effectively. It's very weird. Playing a pendulum monster to a pendulum zone is the same as activating a spell card. It must resolve when played to be in effect. So it's just like any continuous spell card. So you play it, and for it to like be in effect, it has to resolve. So like, yeah. It's very much like a continuous spell card, but they aren't continuous spell cards. You can play as many pendulum monsters to the pendulum zones in a turn, as long as the zones are empty. Yeah, that speaks for itself. When a pendulum monster would be sent from the field to the graveyard, even if it's face down, it is sent to the extra deck face up instead of going to the graveyard. If it will be sent to the graveyard by other means, it is placed in the graveyard as normal. Again, speaks for itself. So, like, as if it's going from anywhere on the field to the graveyard, it goes to the extra instead. Once per turn, during your main phase, you can conduct a pendulum summon. If you have a pendulum monster in both pendulum zones, this allows you to special summon monsters from your hand or face up from your extra deck, whose individual levels are between the pendulum scales of the monsters in the pendulum zones. So, we all know that the pendulum monsters have a scale. It doesn't matter which zone they're in, they just have a scale. So, the one that everyone's saying is about the one that has a scale of 1 and the one that has a scale of 8. So, if we take that example, and you have but one of each in the zone, then you can summon monsters with levels 2 to 7. From face up in your extra deck, or from your hand. If the monsters in the pendulum zones do not have any numbers between their scales, you cannot conduct a pendulum summon. So what I mean by that is if you have a monster with pendulum scale 3, and you have a monster with a pendulum scale 4, or indeed two pendulum scale 3 monsters, you can't conduct a pendulum scale because there are no numbers in between those numbers. The only numbers between 3 and 4 are 3 point something, which is not a level, so you can't do it. If the pendulum summon is negated in some way, so for like Solemn Warning, Solemn Judgment, all the summons are negated, which is very interesting. What I want to know is if this is all like an inherent summon, which it appears to be, can you go Black Horn of Heaven and just negate every single one of those summons and they all go to the graveyard? Because if you can, then if this mechanic ever takes off, Black Horn of Heaven is gonna go up in price. It's gonna be quite a ridiculous card. So that's sort of everything about pendulum summoning. So this is the new playmat. Nothing's changed except they've moved things around so they can fit in these two pendulum zones. That's it. Nothing really changed. We just have those. So we have 6 pendulum monsters that are being revealed so far. So we have the Entomate Kaleidoscorpion, the Entomate Silverclaw, the Entomate Toad, Magician of Astromancy, Magician of Chronomancy, and Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon, which I'm going to go over individually. So, this is the Entomate Kaleidoscorpion. It's a level 6 light insect with 100 attack, 2300 defense, pendulum scale 4. Its pendulum effect is light monsters you control gain 300 attack. That is pretty pitiful. Monster effect, once per turn during your main phase 1, you can target one monster you control. It can attack all special summon monsters your opponent controls once each during each battle phase this turn. This is much better than that first effect, but still, you're not going to run this simply because it's a level 6 monster. It's just, if it was level 4 or level 3, then it would be semi-decent, but because of level 6, it's really bad. It's got a pendulum scale 4. In the current meta, pendulum scale of 4 will be bad, because you look at every meta every deck that's sort of topped over the past month, and a vast majority of monsters in those decks are level 4. So having a pendulum scale of 4, in my opinion, is pretty bad, or having a pendulum scale that doesn't include level 4 is pretty bad. Let's move on to our Intimate Silverclaw. This is the level 4 Dark Beast with 1800 attack, 700 defense, with a pendulum scale of 5. This was the image from the wiki, and it just had the text blanked out for some reason. Anyway, so the pendulum effect is that entomate monsters you control gain 300 attack. Again, that's pretty pitiful. I can see that if you had multiple of these, or like multiple of the Scorpion in your pendulum zones, things gaining 600 attack isn't bad. It's not bad, but it's not fantastic. Its monster effect: when this card declares an attack, all entomate monsters you currently control, gain 300 attack until the end of the battle phase. Again, it's not good. It basically, it's just that the pendulum effect just put into the monster effect, so it's pretty terrible as a card in my opinion. It's just a bit stronger than the rest of them. Moving on, Entomate Tiptoad. This card is pretty good. It's a level 2 water, 0 attack, 800 defense, pendulum scale 3 aqua monster. Its pendulum effect is amazing. Once per turn, you can target one face-up monster on the field, switch its current attack and defense until the end of this turn. Now that is pretty handy, because it's in a pendulum effect, you can play it to your pendulum zone. You can effectively just use this card as every turn you can have a shield and sword. It's pretty good for getting around those massive cards. It makes everything easier to beat over, and if you really needed to do it, you could swap your own monsters. So it's pretty good. It kind of makes it an MST magnet in a way, because if it poses a big enough problem to your opponent, they're going to want to get rid of it, leaving any heavy back row you have. You know, I tend to play a lot of heavy back row decks. That's just how I am. Anyone who plays heavy back row should really play this, I think. I think this could be really beneficial. Its monster effect is once per turn during your battle phase, you can target one monster you control, change its battle position, and if you do, switch its current attack and defense until the end of this turn. So, again, its monster effect isn't bad. It means you can each turn change the battle position of one of your monsters, so you know you can turn it to attack mode, and then activate this and turn it back to defense. So it's like, you can do little things like that, but you're not going to use it for that. Having a pendulum scale of 3 isn't terrible, but not brilliant. It allows pendulum summons of level 4 monsters, which isn't bad. So it's not a terrible card at all. But let's keep moving on. The next one is Magician of Astromancy. This card and the Magician of Chronomancy are both pretty bad cards. So the pendulum effect is if it's a level 5 dark spellcaster, 1200 attack, 2400 defense, pendulum scale 1. Speak, Tom. Its pendulum effect is if a pendulum monster you control battles, your opponent cannot activate any spell cards until the end of the damage step, If you don't have a Magician card or an Odd Eyes card in your other Pendulum zone, this card's Pendulum scale becomes 4. That is atrocious. For the simple reason that the only spell cards that are going to be activated during the battle phase, in the current meta, is Book of Moon and things like lands. Things like Forbidden Lands. That's going to be it. So that's pretty naff, to be honest. And then the second bit is that it's Pendulum Scale 4, unless you have an Odd Eyes or Magician card. So, even if you want to use this as something else, nope, it is not a Pendulum Scale 1. It's a Pendulum Scale 4. And as I've already said, anything with a Pendulum Scale of 4, in my opinion, is terrible. Because it doesn't allow you to summon anything from your deck. And most monsters in this meta, at the moment, are level 4s. Its monster effect, once per turn, when exactly one Pendulum monster you control is returned to your hand by your opponent's card effect, you can special summon a monster with the same name as a returned monster from your hand. Again, that is a really bad effect. This monster is level 5, you're not going to normal summon him, you're going to have to Pendulum summon him. That takes time, and if you want to do it, if you for whatever reason want to get this guy out, that effect isn't fantastic, because it basically means that this guy, it's just such a bad effect. I mean, your opponent isn't going to bounce a Pendulum monster while this guy's on the board. The odds of this guy being on the board is 0. You aren't going to play him unless you want to have a really high defense for some reason, and you tribute summon him face down. But he's terrible. He really is terrible. He is only good when he's combined with Chronomancy, because together they make a Pendulum swing between 2 and 7, which is the biggest range at the moment. So moving on to Chronomancy, it's a level 3 Dark Spellcaster, 1200 attack, 600 defense, Pendulum Scale 8. And the Pendulum effect's almost the same, so it's activate only if you control no monsters. You know, I read that and my head was in my hands. It was just like, it's such a bad thing to put on this. So you can only play him if you control no monsters, which is just atrocious. If a Pendulum monster your opponent you control, why does it say your? If a Pendulum monster you control battles your opponent cannot I cannot speak. Apologies. If a Pendulum monster you control battles, your opponent cannot activate any trap cards until the end of the damage step. If you don't have a Magician card or an Odd Eyes card in either Pendulum in your other Pendulum zone, this card's Pendulum scale becomes 4. Identical effect to Astromancy, except this one is for trap cards, which is a bit better because trap cards are obviously more dominant. But again, you're probably not going to play these Pendulum monsters as monsters. They just don't see it. None of them are good enough. The only one that is good is Tiptoed, and Tiptoed is really good. Its monster effect is once per turn, cards in your Pendulum zone cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. Again, it's kind of pointless, because basically if you were to play in that sense, your opponent can really easily run over this guy, and then just destroy things as they were going to. So it doesn't really make a difference. So the fact that this guy has a lower level, basically what they've done is they've chucked in the activate only if you control no monsters into its Pendulum effect, which is pretty bad. Both of these guys work really well together, but they individually, or with anything else, they're pretty terrible. And then the last one is Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon. So this is semi-decent. So it's a level 7 Dark Dragon, 2500 attack, 2000 defense, Pendulum Scale 4. Its Pendulum effect is you can only use each Pendulum effect of Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon once per turn. You take no battle damage from battles involving a Pendulum monster you control. During your end phase, you can destroy this card, and if you do, add one Pendulum monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck to your hand. So basically this guy can search any of these cards except for your Silver Claw. but it can search all of them, and of course himself. So that's not bad. And of course, because he's destroyed, he goes face up in the extra, so you can just summon him later. His monster effect is any battle damage your opponent takes from battles involving this card, and an opponent's monster is doubled. So that's not bad. So he does double damage to your opponent. So he's big and he puts massive damage on the board. So he is pretty good, especially if you're going for OTKs, which this guy allows actually. So that's that. So now I'm going to say about what I feel. So the entire mechanic is costly, and I mean costly the fact that you have to sacrifice 2 cards from your hand. So you are already 2 cards down, and we also are getting the ruling that you don't draw if you go first. So you'll have 5 cards in your hand. If, for whatever reason, you have your opening hand of 5 or 6 cards, and you want to pendulum summon there and then, 2 of those cards have to be pendulum monsters. Let's say 2 of them are. So let's say you put 2 pendulum monsters in your pendulum zones. Then those other 3 or 4 cards have to be viable cards. If they're not, there's no point in overextending into the pendulum summon. You're just going to get killed very quickly, very easily. But that's not the point. The point is that you're getting rid of 2 cards from your hand to do this. Yes, they have effects while they're in the spell and while they're in the pendulum zones, but they affect specific things. They don't affect like any major element. It's like they're not good yet. They're slow because Odd Eyes is our only searcher, except for like type specific searches and things like that. And they're slow because you need to get them to your hand. You have to get 2 different pendulum monsters with a scale difference to your hand. Otherwise, this is pointless. That's why it's slow. Playing this adds inconsistency. And it adds inconsistency simply because you're drawing cards that can be pointless in the current situation. I keep thinking of the time when I built Dark World Infernities. And as a whole, the deck was okay. It wasn't amazing, but it wasn't terrible. But it had times and specific hands, definitely, where I could go off. It was amazing. And then there were other times when the 2 archetypes contradicted each other, and effectively you lost because you lost to yourself, because the deck didn't work with itself. And that's what I mean with this, that I feel that pendulum summoning is going to effectively be an archetype. They're going to make enough of these to build a deck around, like have an entire deck made of these monsters. And I think that is going to be the only way in which these will actually be good. Apart from in some select decks, which might come about. That's what I mean about only good at the right time with the right hand. I feel it's a situational mechanic. Just like, you have to have... Everything has to fall into place. If anything is stopped, it can be quite crippling. Like, if you play a pendulum monster in a pendulum zone, and it gets MST'd on activation, and that's thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. I feel that the monsters are only going to be used for their effects instead of the pendulum summonings, like the Tiptoad. Tiptoad is phenomenal for his effect, just for the fact that, cool, I can now beat over that massive grapher. And I don't feel that they're going to be used for pendulum summonings, at least not yet, until we get better support and better cards. I also feel that Konami are doing this because they want to make high-level monsters more viable. Because if we look at all the decks that have topped in the past month, the only high-level monsters that are run by those decks can be quite easily played. But there are so many other older monsters with high levels that are pretty decent, like Jinzo, that are only played in certain decks because only those certain decks can actually utilize them properly. But I think what Konami are trying to do is make these older higher level monsters far more viable, so that you can play them in a greater variety of decks. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Something else? No, I'm not. I've forgotten. Again, I don't feel they're going to be good until there's at least a deck's worth of pendulum monsters to put all together in a single deck. I just don't see it being good until then. And to everyone who is saying, I'm going to quit because this is so overpowered, it is not. It is no way a game-breaking mechanic. Because of the fact it is so slow and inconsistent. When we get more searches, and we get better cards, then it might become a viable thing to splash. But any deck at the moment that can run it probably won't, because the decks run perfectly well by themselves, as they are. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is the decks that I feel that could, stressing could, don't need, but could use pendulum summons. These 5 decks, I feel, are probably the only decks that could utilize pendulum summons when they come out. Just for, a quick sort of field spam. Just a one-turn thing that they're never going to use again, but it's a one-turn play. Now, I feel that every other deck, these decks, they don't need pendulum summoning. If anything, pendulum summoning might make them worse. Because pendulum summoning at the moment is so slow and so underwhelming. So, let's go over these. So, Hieratic Ruler. I feel this would be good because, again, I'm going to take the ideal situation for each of these decks, that you have 2 pendulum monsters, scale 1 to 8, and you have 4 monsters between those scales. So let's look at Hieratic Rulers. So you play the 2 pendulum monsters, and then you dump your hand. So in amongst those you might have a Dragon Ruler, 3 Hieratics, or 2 Dragon Rulers if you're lucky, and 2 Hieratics. Those Hieratic monsters contribute one another, get rid of a card, get the normal monster, carry on the plays, get Atom, get Red Eyes, bring something back, make plays. And then the Dragon Rulers can make Dracosac, or Big Eye, or Master of Blades, or something. And then, because the dragons haven't used their effects, you can then bring them back if you use them, if you detach them as a material. So it sort of makes for a really, really hefty and speedy OTK. And I thought the Hieratic Rulers, it might be alright. But Hieratic Rulers aren't a deck that have a big hand. If their hand is gone, their hand tends not to come back. Infernities. Again, for the simple reason, you are dropping your entire hand. Any Archfiends in there are going to pull off their effect, and you have more monsters to play for the turn. That's the only reason why I say that. It just seems a viable option. Dark Worlds, after discarding Graphers and getting extra draws and things. See, Dark World might actually be a deck, because they have so much draw power, they can actually probably get to their pendulum monsters really quite easily and make some decent plays. But what I thought is that they could ditch Graphers to grave, pop cards, play, discard silvers, golds, and beige, bounce them back to hand for the Graphers, and then pendulum summon back what you just returned to hand. So you can make a really, really big push for game. And I think that it might be a bit consistent in Dark Worlds, but just simply because of that, because you can drop your hand, pull off their effects. And Dark Worlds have enough draw power to be able to do that. Gadgets are another very, very viable deck, for the simple reason that gadgets can, they get their effects when special summoned. So, again, 2 monsters to Pendulum zones. Ideally, you have 2 gadgets in hand and 2 other random things. So you summon 2 gadgets, those other 2 random things, you get 2 gadgets from deck to hand. You have plays for next turn, and because it's gadgets, you can just drop those 2 gadgets next turn. When you Pendulum summon next turn, get 2 more gadgets to hand, and you can just Pendulum summon every turn and get another summon effectively every turn. So for gadgets, it's a viable deck, but unlike Dark World, they don't really have the draw power or the search power, so it probably wouldn't be very good. My thoughts with Fire Kings were that, again, you can drop your hand. Let's say you drop 4 monsters. If they want to Solemn Warning you, that's cool, you get their effects. Or if they want to do something to destroy you, cool, you get their effects. It doesn't matter if they get stopped or not. You're going to get their effects off. So that's what I've got to say about this. I feel that, like, overall, the mechanic isn't there yet. It's not a bad mechanic in theory. I see it definitely has potential, and for certain decks, it could really be a very, very helpful thing in the future. But right now, there are going to be people who test them and feel they're really good, and then there are going to be other people like me who are just going to be like, well, it's not quite there yet. There's nothing really that can help a deck. It's inconsistent. It's slow. Let's just stick to standard deck building techniques and not do that. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick with original decks, original deck building techniques, until this gets better, because it isn't there right now. So, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Thank you.